Okay, hey everybody, we're moving on from the demonstrations in Birmingham to the March on Washington. So, once President Kennedy proposed the idea that we needed legislation to make segregation illegal nationwide in every state, Martin Luther King and the SCLC, with the support of the college branch SNCC, decided that it would be smart to come together in Washington and lobby for the passage of the bill. Most people at the time thought the passage of the bill would be a huge long shot and likely a political impossibility, but they thought that a large presence of support for it by both black activists as well as white folks and a lot of popular and celebrity elements from Hollywood, as well as the speakers from the civil rights leadership, that would bring about a massive appeal to get it passed. So the goal of the March on Washington in the summer of 1963 was to lobby for the passage of the bill. There's a lot of intrigue about what would happen the day that the march took place, but ultimately it was peaceful and there were no direct violent attacks during the day or a large presence of opposition. Over 250,000 people gathered on the lawn of the Lincoln Memorial and the Mall of Washington, D.C. There were speeches throughout the day to a very diverse audience, actually. And it ended with Martin Luther King giving his famous I Have a Dream speech, which I'm sure you have heard at least portions of many, many times, but is considered to be one of the finest examples of American rhetoric in American history. As I said that day, it was peaceful, but later in Birmingham, Alabama, it was considered a connection to this event that the KKK bombed a church in Birmingham, killing 4 small girls who were in the basement of the church at the time of the bombing. And that was in some ways considered to be retribution for the events of Washington and the march. Through the most amazing sets of political circumstances, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 got passed. It was largely important and due to the fact that President Kennedy gets assassinated in November of 1963, and his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, becomes president. Lyndon Baines Johnson was absolutely committed to the passage of this law, and he had been in Congress for a very long time and called in a whole lot of favors and used a whole lot of personal and political will to call in those favors to force people who were personally not excited about voting for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to vote for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. There was a very long filibuster. It was a lot of political intrigue, but eventually the law did get passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is probably the most important law that's ever been passed. It banned discrimination on the basis of, you can see on the screen, race, ethnicity, national origin, actually, religion, and then they threw in gender. Gender was considered to be the perfect way to, ruin the bill, because back then it was considered ridiculous that we would not discriminate on the basis of gender. That was a time period where the wanted ads for jobs in the paper were jobs for men and jobs for women. So they thought by adding gender into the bill that it would basically make it impossible to get passed. It did pass. And it is the basis by which discriminated groups have sought redress in the courts, and a whole set of protections have been gained over the years thanks to the protection offered by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I just want to clarify, though, that it protected people against discrimination in public accommodations. So that means like McDonald's, if they're open to the public, they can't discriminate on the basis of race or religion or gender. Private clubs, though, and membership-based organizations can. So can any organization that does not receive or refuses to receive money from the federal government. So that's why you can still have gender-segregated colleges or golf clubs or country clubs that don't admit members of certain races or genders. That is legal, and why a lot of times those organizations are membership-based. They ask you to pay a membership fee or fill out an application to become a member, those kinds of things. So, that's the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the protections it granted as well as its limitations. This is a picture of the March on Washington and Martin Luther King's presence there. All right, after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is passed, they decide to focus on something much more complicated. really the easiest part, I don't want to say any part of the civil rights struggle was easy, but the clearest part was the visual separation of the races in public spaces. A more complicated part is voting. The reason why that's complicated is that voting is controlled by each state. The 50 states totally control the elections apparatus that exists within their boundaries. And each state can choose to do voting a little bit differently. And so it was really like a devil in the details situation. If you wanted to address voting rights, you had to do it on a state-by-state basis. And sometimes even like a local precinct level, based on how voting registration was being done at local courthouses in different parts of states. So when they decided to embark on addressing voting rights next, they decided to embark on a very complicated and difficult subject. The most famous next phase of the civil rights movement is what's called Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer was the summer of 1964, when they decided to go into the state of Mississippi and do a protracted and focused effort to try and get more Black people registered and able to vote. Only 5% of the voting population in Mississippi, only 5% of Blacks in Mississippi were registered. The reason was the same tools were being used in Mississippi as all the other southern states, like literacy tests, poll taxes, and requiring you to pay past poll taxes from years previous before you could vote, and grandfather clauses and all kinds of other impediments to keep Black people from voting. Also, they even made it difficult to register to vote. So they would say that you could register to vote at 9 o'clock on Tuesday, but if they noticed there were Black people lined up to participate in that process, they would suddenly say the clerk was sick and they would move it to Thursday. Okay, so there was all these kind of cat and mouse games going on with just trying to get Black people registered to vote in Mississippi. In the summer of '64, they decided to bring, this was CORE, the SCLC, SNCC, all of these organizations worked together on Freedom Summer, and they decided to bring 1,000 college students into the state to start educating people in cooperation with the locals about how registration works and how you could try and pass the literacy tests and those kinds of things. So they were spread out throughout the Mississippi in that summer. It's worth noting that just the year before that, they had actually murdered Medgar Evers, the head of the NAACP, in his own driveway in front of his 3 children and wife. And so just the year previous that had happened. So everybody kind of knew that Mississippi was a hotbed of discrimination and violence, and that the resistance would be significant. That voter registration drive ultimately did get a lot of Mississippians registered to vote, but in the process, the Klan killed 4 and wounded 4. 80 people were beaten, 30 businesses were bombed that were Black-owned, 37 churches were bombed. So there was a lot of violence in response to this effort to give Black people in Mississippi more political power. There was no federal response during that time period. So at this point, we start to see a division growing between the more radical college students in the movement and the older generation. So Martin Luther King's kind of older generation organization was called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC. The college students had formed a college version of that called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Well, SNCC was wanting to be a little bit more strident in their actions, and that had even manifested itself at the March on Washington when John Lewis wanted to speak, and his words he prepared were a little more strident in their tone. John Lewis, by the way, is a congressman today, one of the last surviving members of the civil rights era. He actually has cancer and is not particularly well. But they wanted to do more radical actions, and they proposed a 50-mile march from Selma to Montgomery to continue focusing on voting rights. So this is in Alabama, another viciously racist southern state. Martin Luther King was originally opposed to the idea, and he didn't think it was a great idea, but he realized that there was this inevitability in these college students that this is what should be done, so he put the college students in charge of it, and they planned the 50-mile route, and they started the march, and it was quickly halted because of violence that broke out, police brutality on the Pettus Bridge that was at the beginning of the march. Video went out of the protesters being kind of viciously attacked by policemen on horseback and with batons. And at that point, Martin Luther King, was rather annoyed because he knew this wasn't going to go great. He said, okay, fine, I guess I have to come lead this march because we can't not have the march now. We can't back down. So they restarted the march, and it was completed over a matter of days. One person was killed in the original start of the march, but no one was killed the second time around that they did the march. There was a much greater press presence, and there were also celebrities on hand, at least for the start. As a result of this march, they did get attention to voting rights, and eventually the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. Very important piece of legislation. It basically got rid of the literacy test, which said you can no longer require people to take complicated constitutional tests in order to vote. Especially only black people, which is the way it had been administered in many states due to the grandfather clause. The 24th Amendment to the Constitution got rid of the poll tax. So between the 24th Amendment and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, we see greater access to the ballot by black people after that time period. Another really important thing happened in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They basically put the southern states on restriction, and they made it so they could not change their voting laws without pre-approval by the feds to make sure that those laws weren't racist in their intention. And that would be the case until federal law changed that. And that only recently happened. Okay, so for a long time, from 1965 until very recently, if North Carolina wanted to change anything about their voting laws, they had to go get approval from the federal government. It's interesting when that was lifted, because the idea was that now the southern states knew how to behave about making voting laws. That's when the whole voter ID thing has become a big issue. And that's why a lot of people think that voter ID is really not necessarily about voter fraud, but more about trying to revive some kind of laws that are particularly effective at blocking out participation in voting by vulnerable minority communities. So we'll just see how that has how that proceeds, and why that kind of historical context might help you understand the two sides of that question. I love this picture in the top left. This is the beginning of the march. I just think it's so amazing how they're dressed. They're about to march 50 miles. They're wearing church clothes. It goes over multiple days. They depend upon just the local population to come out and bring them sandwiches, and they sleep in fields on blankets. And 50 miles is a long time. I've marched 26 miles over 2 days, and 50 miles? It's a long way. And then you can see some of the police brutality that beset the march at the beginning on the right. Also going on throughout this whole time period is the integration of the universities of the nation. This was also a little more complicated because the universities are run by separate states, and states run their university systems differently. But certainly civil rights activists thought that every public college that received federal money under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, it said that they could not discriminate. So we had to put pressure on them to quit doing that. And two of the most famous examples of this were at the University of Mississippi and at the University of Alabama. James Meredith was a Korean War veteran who wanted to attend the University of Mississippi. He applied and was accepted. The governor blocked his actual physical presence coming to the campus to register. And they actually arranged for him to get registered and attend off campus, at least the registration process. And the governor somehow got wind of it and actually showed up there off campus to block him from registering. Eventually, and the same goes for the University of Alabama, where George Wallace, who would later run for president in 1968 and be paralyzed by an assassination attempt, he stood in the doorway of the University of Alabama to stop Vivian Malone and Jimmy Hood from attending the University of Alabama. Both of them eventually gained admission and entry into the college of their choice by federal marshals coming in to shepherd them into the facilities and protect them while they attended. So this is very much like the earlier K-12 events, but they were going on a little later in the 1960s. This is James Meredith on the left, and in the upper right is George Wallace, and below in the bottom right is Vivian Hood being pictured walking into the University of Alabama. All right, so we're going to pause there. We're at about 15 minutes, so I don't want to go beyond that. That is the end, the final key events of the Civil Rights Movement. And our next video, we're going to pick up with just a focus on the Black Panthers, the Nation of Islam, and more strident efforts by Black leaders to remedy the discrimination experienced by Black people in America. Okay, thanks a lot. See you next time.